The NHL trade deadline has come and gone, and we saw some massive moves this year, from Mikko Rantanen getting traded and then traded again. The guys like Brock Nelson, Scott Laughton, Brandon Carlo, and of course Brad Marchand all getting moved this year. But after this flurry of trades, which teams came out on top? Who got the best value for their assets? And which teams paid the cheapest price to get better? Well, today I have 5 teams that I think won the deadline and 5 teams who lost it. And we'll start with the losers. Number 5 on my list is the Philadelphia Flyers, who traded away a lot of assets and, in my opinion, didn't get much back in return. Going back even to last month when they traded away Joel Farabee and Morgan Frost, they only got back Andrei Kuzmenko, a good young player and former first-round pick, and Jacob Peltier, and a second-round pick, in a deal that I honestly think is pretty fair to both sides. The problem is that after that, they proceeded to give away just about every asset that they had. They traded Kuzmenko to the LA Kings for just a 2027 third-round pick. For Scott Laughton, a very good middle six winger, they got back a first-round pick next year, which is good, and Nikita Kraken, who is a good young player. That's not a terrible trade in my opinion, but I do think that they could have gotten better value. And then they trade away Eric Johnson to the Colorado Avalanche for Gavani Smith, and I understand Eric Johnson's not doing much for you in Philly, but he still has value that's greater than a career AHLer. Take a late-round draft pick or a prospect, and I'd like this trade a lot more. So none of those trades that I just mentioned do I think Philadelphia got absolutely fleeced, but I think that they just came up on the wrong side of all of them, and that accumulation of lost value, in my opinion, makes them one of the losers of the trade deadline. On the winner's side, the team that did the 5th best today, in my opinion, was the Tampa Bay Lightning. They only made one trade, but it was a doozy, and I think that they got great value out of it. For trading away Michael Eyssimont and a second-round pick in this year's draft, along with a first-round pick in the next 2 drafts, 2026 and 2027, they got back Oliver Bjorkstrand, Yanni Gourde, Kyle Aucoin, and a 5th-round pick in next year's draft. To me, that is fantastic value. I know that they gave up a lot in terms of draft capital, but Oliver Bjorkstrand is still a very good top 6 forward, and Yanni Gourde is still a legit middle 6 to bottom 6 winger. So they got 2 really good assets that are really going to help them this year in exchange for, honestly, not a lot of assets in terms of what's immediately coming up. The second-round pick is going to hurt them, but other than that, they're not paying the price on this trade until a year down the road at least. And with this trade, I think that the Lightning are signaling that they're going to continue to try and be competitive for the next few years with their players like Braden Point and Kucherov, so I think that they're banking that those 2 picks are going to be in the later half of the first round. Now, the team on the other side of that deal, the Seattle Kraken, in my opinion, lost the trade deadline. It's in part because of not maximizing the value that they got for giving up Bjorkstrand and Gourde, but the mistakes Ron Francis made go beyond this trade. They gave up Brandon Tanev to the Winnipeg Jets for just a 2027 second-round pick. Even though it's a strong pick, that's not really great value, especially when you see that a guy like Anthony Beauvillier got a second-round pick in this year's draft. I think you could have gotten much better value for Tanev, who is quite frankly a better player than Beauvillier. And then they gave away Daniel Sprong to the New Jersey Devils for a 7th-round pick in next year's draft. That's basically nothing, and Daniel Sprong can be a competent bottom 6 winger with a good scoring touch, and I wouldn't be surprised if he finds a home for himself in New Jersey. He's usually productive everywhere he goes, and I think Seattle could have gotten something back for him. I just think overall, in being sellers, Seattle didn't maximize their value. Now, a team who I think quietly did maximize their value is one of the teams who added, and ironically a team that traded with Seattle, the Winnipeg Jets. Getting Brandon Tanev for just a second-round pick in 2027, like I said, I think is pretty good value. And then they also got a pretty good depth defenseman in Luke Schenn for just a second-round pick next year and a 4th-round pick in 2027. I don't think Winnipeg blew the other teams out of the water in terms of the value that they got in these trades, but for where they are, a team that really needs to round out their depth and just wanted to add in the back tier of the trade deadline, they didn't give up too much value in my opinion. Moving on to my number 3 team who lost the trade deadline, it is unsurprising that they would be on this list. The Carolina Hurricanes just botched the Mikko Rantanen situation so badly. A combination of them buying too high on him and not being able to sign him, and then selling low on him. Now, I will say they got back some really good assets for him. Logan Stankoven's a good young player, and they did get back 1st-round picks and 3rd-round picks in the 26 and 27 drafts. That is decent value, but Mikko Rantanen is, in my opinion, an incredibly underrated and efficient scorer. And if you're a team like the Carolina Hurricanes who is still in that cup contending window, you should be trying to keep a guy like that, not trade him away for less value than they gave up to get him. Remember, they traded him for Jack Drury, Marty Necas, a second-round pick, a 26th fourth-round pick, and a third-round pick that went to Chicago. And yes, they also got Taylor Hall out of that deal, which is great for them. But man, even though they were able to recover the best that they could, I think Carolina botched this entire situation. And no surprise, the team that got Mikko Rantanen is another one of my big winners at the trade deadline. I think Dallas absolutely killed it. They got, in my opinion, the best player on the market, and they didn't have to give up an arm and a leg for him. Losing Stankoven really does hurt, but they also didn't give up a first-round pick or a second-round pick in this year's draft. They still have a glut of good young forwards, guys like Maverick Bourque, Wyatt Johnston, who they just re-signed, and I really like this Mikko Rantanen ad. I think it makes him an immediate Cup favorite right now. And let's not forget, they also did a great job, in my opinion, in the Kyle Granlund trade. They got great value for him. Yes, they had to give up a first and a third this year, so they don't have first-round picks in any of their next drafts, but Granlund is a perfect middle six forward for them. They also got Cody Ceci for some depth. I just think all in all, Dallas killed it this trade deadline, and they're one of the Cup favorites for a reason. Moving on to the team that had the second worst trade deadline, in my opinion, it was the Nashville Predators. In a seller's market, the Predators somehow got absolutely dominated, from trading away Gustav Nyquist for just a second-round pick next year, to trading away Tommy Novak and Luke Schenn and watching Pittsburgh then flip Luke Schenn for some pretty good value in their trade with Winnipeg. Yes, they got Michael Bunting. Yes, they got a fourth-round pick next year. They also dumped Mark Jankowski for a fifth-round pick next year, which is basically nothing, and Jankowski, who right now is at least a depth defenseman, you can't really count on a fifth-round pick ever turning into anything. Just all in all, Barry Trotz shipped away a lot of assets and did not get good value in return. Now, the team that had the second best trade deadline, in my opinion, is another team that was involved in the Mikko Rantanen sweepstakes, the Colorado Avalanche. They traded him away and, in my opinion, got back really good value compared to what Carolina got when they traded him the second time. Getting Necas, getting Drury, getting a second-round pick this year and a fourth-round pick next year was a really good job by Chris McFarland. Yes, it's got to sting to see him go back into your division and sign for the same amount that you were offering him, but you did right by your team. You also added Ryan Lindgren from the New York Rangers, and I know Rangers fans will laugh and say Lindgren's not very good, but you really didn't give up much to get him. The second-round pick is really the only big asset you had to give up for him. I think that trade was pretty fair on both sides, and then you also added Brock Nelson, though I will say giving up Cal Ritchie and a future first does make that a little bit harder to swallow. I don't think it's terrible value. You got Eric Johnson for basically free, like I mentioned, but the only trade where I think Colorado definitely did lose was adding Charlie Coyle in exchange for Middlestat, Zellers, and a second-round pick this year. Like, Coyle is good, yes, and Middlestat wasn't really fitting into your system. I get that, but Middlestat is still really good and younger. I feel like you could have just maximized that value a little bit more, maybe not had to give up that second-round pick. And finally, the team who I think lost the deadline the hardest out of anybody. Bad teams stay bad for a reason. It's the Chicago Blackhawks. To start, they traded away Taylor Hall for a third-round pick that was theirs just to retain some salary and help out the Hurricanes and Avalanche do that Mikko Rantanen deal. I hated that at the time, and I still think it was a bad move, but then they went and traded away Seth Jones to the Florida Panthers in exchange for Spencer Knight and a 2026 first-round pick. Not terrible value, but again, I think for Seth Jones, especially in a seller's market, you could have gotten more for him. I know Chicago fans are loath to hear it, but Seth Jones is still a legitimate top four defenseman, and you got less for him in return value than the Rangers did for Ryan Lindgren, who I think is a worse defenseman than Seth Jones. And then even with the smaller trades, I think Chicago still made a mistake by trading for Joe Veleno and giving up Craig Smith and Peter Mrazek. Detroit is desperate for goaltending stability, and all you could leverage out of them is Joe Veleno, who's a fourth liner and not all that young. Like, get some prospects, get some picks back for this guy. I know that Mrazek's not like John Gibson or anything like that, but he's still worth more. And you threw in Craig Smith along with him and didn't get anything back for that. I think I don't know what Chicago is doing here. They came away from this deadline with just an extra third-round pick and a first-round pick next year, when teams who had significantly fewer assets to move with got better value in return. And then the team who won the trade deadline, it should be obvious by this point, the Florida Panthers absolutely crushed it. Like I said, Seth Jones, I think that they got good value back for him. It does stink losing Spencer Knight and a first-round pick next year, but Seth Jones will step in and be a top four defenseman for them immediately and pay dividends alongside better partners like Nico Mikkola. They also managed to pour salt in the wounds of one of their most bitter rivals by taking away Boston's heart, Brad Marchand, their captain, for just a second-round pick 2 years from now. That is an absolute fleecing by the Panthers and one of the most lopsided deals of the entire trade deadline.